When you hear the word opioid on the news, it's usually attached to other words, including crisis and epidemic. Opioid stories have become a staple of the nightly news as politicians at the state, local, and federal levels demand crackdowns and other initiatives. One side of the opioid issue has been largely ignored, though, the needs of chronic pain patients. Tonight, the I-Team's George Knapp is here to preview a week-long investigation of the opioid conundrum.
Well, John, everyone listening to this program has either experienced chronic pain or has someone in their family struggling with pain issues. An estimated 100 million Americans cope with chronic pain, and tens of millions of those rely on opioids as one part of their treatment. The medications help them function, go to work, live semi-normal lives. Not anymore. The crackdown aimed at drug abusers dying of ODs has led to abandonment of legitimate patients who've been forced to live in agony.
It was totally different. It was a whole new level of pain that you just don't even think, you can't even imagine it until you experience it. And there's other conditions like arachnoiditis that nobody has heard about or knows about, but they cause this burning fire pain that is excruciating and can make you question, do I even want to be alive if you can't get the right treatment for it?
It takes over everything, yes. When you are in pain, it's hard to explain to people that have not felt the pain that you feel because you can't explain how it incapacitates you.
Did you think you're going to die?
Yeah. Honestly, I was pretty close to killing myself because I just didn't think I could handle it.
He said, "Don't you dare let this doctor get away with this." And he took the gun out and he put it up to his chest and he pulled the trigger.
It's almost unbelievable the number of people whose lives have been destroyed, the number of people who are planning suicides, the number of people who tell me they don't want to live, and that they see no hope and no future because they've been abandoned by their doctors.
Patients have had it. They're tired of being looked at as being criminals because they have chronic pancreatitis or chronic back pain. It's gone too far.
The federal government is sort of giving the message, we don't care if you die. We don't care if you suffer. We don't care if you lose your doctor. We don't care if you have unnecessary surgery. We don't care if you're called a drug addict or have to go into a mental health center. We don't care anymore.
Back in September, we aired our first report on this project in hopes that pain patients would reach out to us and tell us their stories. I'm still getting calls and emails by the hundreds. We interviewed dozens of people, pain sufferers, pain experts, doctors, regulators, people on the front lines. There is a silent opioid crisis, but it's not the one that's been reported so far. All this week, then, our news team will be showing you the faces of pain, how legitimate patients have become collateral damage, abandoned by doctors and pharmacists who've been intimidated based on evidence that is specious and contradictory. Our Pain, the Other Side of Opioids is the operating title, with news stories airing each night at 6 and 11, starting Monday night, with how politicians and the media have exploited and muddied these issues. You've covered some of this stuff. You've
covered some of this stuff here, covered some of the stuff in other cities I've worked in, and it's a major issue in all across the country, but especially in southern Nevada. So many people dealing with chronic pain.
Well, it's coming to a head, and I think we're going to have to help shine a light on it now.
We'll see how the light is shown this week. Thanks, George.
Sure.
You're watching 8 News Now at 6.
Well, millions of Americans who rely on opioid medications for pain relief are in anguish because of government pressure to reduce prescriptions across the board.
Doctors, pharmacists, and other providers have already made drastic cuts in the amount of pain medicine that they can dispense, with more cuts on the way. Now, the actions are being taken in response to media reports about the opioid epidemic.
And tonight we begin a week-long investigative project examining the other side of opioids. I-Team reporter George Knapp starts it off. George?
Well, can you imagine diabetics being told, sorry, no more insulin can be prescribed, or cancer patients being told that chemotherapy is no longer an option? We Americans like to say we don't want anything to come between a doctor and a patient, but for tens of millions of chronic pain patients, there's an entire gaggle of middlemen who decide whether a patient gets medicine that their doctor has prescribed.
Metro Police says a former patient walked into the Center for Wellness and Pain Care and demanded to be seen immediately. He was refused. came back with a gun and started shooting.
When Las Vegas mental health counselor Chad Broderick shot up a pain clinic before taking his own life back in June, some media reports explained it as the actions of a drug addict. Those who know Broderick say it wasn't addiction that drove him over the edge, it was pain. An estimated 100 million Americans, 1 in 3, have experienced chronic pain, that is, pain lasting longer than 3 months. Of those, as many as 30 million are now considered to be collateral damage because of a war against opioids.
I've been through overtreatment, undertreatment, mistreatment, no treatment.
Barbie Engel was a coach at a major university, ran her own business, was happily married. Pain took it all away.
Every single aspect of your life, physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially, it wiped me out.
Serious injuries put her in a wheelchair for 7 years, which caused other painful diseases, including something called RSD.
It feels like someone put lighter fluid on me, caught me on fire, and it's just really difficult to put out.
43 doctors later, she was treated with a powerful pain medication and got her life back.
What happened to me should never happen to anybody.
She now advocates for other pain patients who have, in effect, become opioid refugees.
There's 100 million Americans, and here in Nevada, there's 980,000 approximately chronic pain patients that need help, that need assistance, that need to find something that works for them. And opiates shouldn't be taken off the table because there's a media hype and there's a hysteria.
Opiates have been used by humans to control pain for thousands of years. Synthetic versions, opioids, are not appropriate for all pain patients, but are a godsend for millions.
We start this hour with the opioid epidemic.
That word, opioid, is now a staple of nightly newscasts, and the reports typically show pictures of prescription bottles and pain pills, implying that prescription drugs are responsible for an ever-changing number of deaths, 16,000 per year, 30,000, 100,000. The parameters and definitions have proven very flexible.
I did a 24-hour study using Google News, and this is in May of last year, and I put in one word, opioid, and I got 75 stories. And every story had some combination of the words epidemic, overdose, abuse, death.
Dr. Michael Shatman is an internationally known pain expert who spent much of his career getting patients off opioids. He says the numbers used to generate anti-opioid hysteria are both exaggerated and distorted. In a paper he co-authored, he writes that the generally accepted base number, 16,000 opioid deaths per year, is largely the result of illicit street drugs, not prescription drugs.
80% of the opioid deaths were due to, we'll say, non-pharmaceutical fentanyl. Because it is an analog of fentanyl, which is a prescription drug, it goes down as a prescription opioid death.
The states often cited as the deadliest for opioid ODs have seen huge increases in illicit fentanyl. Nationally, fentanyl deaths jumped 540% in a 3-year period. In Western states, the illicit opiate of choice is heroin, which is cheap, plentiful, and far more powerful than in past years.
Illicit fentanyl and heroin are the drivers of overdose today. Those are illicit opioids.
Dr. Steven Ziegler is a social scientist, not a medical doctor. He has no dog in the opioid fight, but bemoans what he calls patient abandonment. That is, legitimate pain patients who are cut off from treatment because of deaths from street drugs.
We're focusing on prescribers for a problem that is significantly being driven by an illicit market. So it's almost like we're arresting the wrong person. And when you arrest the wrong person, that means the real suspects are still out there in the loose causing harm.
In Nevada, an opioid task force was created in response to numbers showing Nevada in the top 5 for opioid prescriptions per capita. But Nevada isn't close to the top 5 for opioid deaths. In fact, opioid overdoses in Nevada have declined every year since 2011. The only category showing an increase is deaths from heroin. A closer look at the list of opioid deaths, as reported by the county coroner, show that nearly all of them involve multiple substances, including heroin, methadone, methamphetamine, cocaine, and alcohol. And many of the dead had serious underlying medical conditions. If there's any trace of an opioid in their systems, they count as opioid ODs.
A study came out just this year looking at the toxicology of people who died of, supposed prescription opioid deaths. The average number of substances found in the system, including alcohol, amphetamines, cocaine, tranquilizers, generally benzodiazepines, was 6. And we're not talking about 16,000 prescription opioid deaths. We're talking more about 1,600.
Millions of legitimate pain patients are now living in fear and anguish because they know that even if their doctors think the medication will help them, they simply aren't going to get it. Many have lost hope, and like Chad Broderick, who was profiled in that story, have taken their own lives. Tonight at 11, how the CDC set the opioid mess into motion. And online, we have a ton of additional resources where you can learn more about pain, including the coroner's report that lists all these local deaths that have been ascribed to opioids, all the other factors that are involved.
Oh my goodness, so much information. Thank you so much,
We'll
George.
be back.
As many as 100 million Americans have experienced chronic pain, and about 30 million of those have relied on opioid medications to ease their pain. The number of opioid prescriptions has been dropping for the last few years, even as the number of opioid deaths keeps going up.
One of the main reasons pain prescriptions are dropping is because of guidelines promoted by the Centers for Disease Control. Critics say the CDC created those guidelines behind closed doors, and that these so-called voluntary standards should never have been adopted as law. The I-Team's George Knapp has more in part 2 of our series, The Other Side of Options.
The terrible events of October 1st not only saw the murder of 58 innocent people, but potentially created more than 500 pain patients, many of whom will need opioids for months or longer to ease their suffering. As it stands, though, they, along with millions of others with chronic pain, won't get what they need.
Millions of our fellow citizens are already addicted.
The president, his wife, his advisors, and just about everyone else in public life have weighed in on the so-called opioid crisis.
Public enemy number 1 in the United States is drug abuse.
For more than a century, American politicians have scored points by declaring war on various drugs, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, all of which are still widely available. But the new drug war has already made a huge dent because its target is legally prescribed. The impetus started about 15 years ago when doctors, pharmacy chains, and drug companies unleashed a new generation of pain medications. Pill mills flourished. Patients died. But the pill mills have since been shut down.
All the records show is that the prescribing hit its peak in 2010, and the number of opioids and the amount of opioids being prescribed has been in decline ever since then.
Pat Anson of the Pain News Network says opioid deaths are up because of illicit drugs like heroin and fentanyl. He thinks the crackdown on legal pain meds is misguided, which is why he suspects the CDC created the policy in secrecy.
They knew right away, and they did it illegally, too. They did it without holding public hearings like they were supposed to.
In March 2016, the CDC issued what it called voluntary guidelines, suggestions for general practitioners about how to rein in opioid prescriptions, including a proposed cap on daily dosages called a morphine equivalent standard.
The notion of morphine equivalent daily dosing is just absurd.
Pain expert Dr. Michael Shatman says there is no science whatsoever behind a morphine equivalent standard, and that it is preposterous to declare that when it comes to pain medication, one size fits all. In a scathing paper recently published, Shatman and his co-author pummeled CDC for creating guidelines in total secrecy. The identities of the expert committee were not revealed, even when 6 members of Congress wrote to ask what was going on. When the names finally leaked, they were widely regarded as anti-opioid crusaders. CDC used exaggerated data to justify its guidelines, Shatman said, and his paper noted CDC had never even mentioned chronic pain on its website prior to issuing the guidelines. Worst of all, the guidelines were adopted as law by states all over the U.S.
Unfortunately, insurance companies, state regulators, health insurance quality organizations have all decided to ignore the specific content of the CDC guideline and to kind of weaponize it. So they've taken some dose thresholds and said, look, we're going to force the dose down, whether the patient likes it or not, whether the doctor likes it or not.
13 different medical organizations, including the American Cancer Society, complained about the lack of transparency in the CDC process and the likelihood that patients in extreme pain would be denied treatment. CDC responded by hiring a PR firm to promote the guidelines further. Pain doctor Forrest Tennant thinks this sends a loud message.
The federal government is sort of giving the message, we don't care if you die. We don't care if you suffer. We don't care if you lose your doctor. We don't care if you have unnecessary surgery. We don't care if you're called a drug addict or have to go into a mental health center. We don't care anymore.
George Knapp, 8 News Now.
A document obtained through the Freedom of Information Act shows the PR company hired by the CDC advised its client that the voluntary standards were causing chaos for pain patients across the country.
CDC has given no indication that it plans to change those standards. Pain patients are bracing for another cut in medication supplies in the coming year.
Now, tomorrow at 6 and 11, how pain patients and their doctors are living in fear. We have further resources on our website.
You're watching 8 News Now at 6.
Well, millions of patients in chronic pain are required to sign contracts with their doctors which authorize random drug tests so the physicians can verify the patients are taking the medications as prescribed. But that's not the only reason.
It's also to check to see if patients are abusing other drugs so doctors can, weed out any addicts seeking pain meds. But now, because of pressure from the CDC, the DEA, and other government agencies, pain patients who follow doctors' orders have seen their medications slashed or eliminated.
And tonight in part 3 of our series, The Other Side of Opioids, the ITM's George Knapp reports on how those cuts have affected patients' lives.
Since we first announced this project back in September, we've been flooded with emails, phone calls, and Facebook posts from pain patients telling their stories. The stories are gut-wrenching, heartbreaking. Many of them feel abandoned by their doctors, are no longer able to work, can't care for their families. Worst of all, they worry about the next round of cuts in their medications. Tonight, the patients tell their stories, starting with a man whose family name is well known in Nevada.
On June 24th, 1961, I had an airplane crash.
At the ripe old age of 18, fledgling pilot John Lear crashed this plane and was hospitalized with multiple injuries.
I broke both ankles, broke both legs in 3 places, broke my jaw, lost all my front teeth, had a concussion, crushed my neck.
Doctors told Lear he would never walk again. They were wrong. He spent 35 years as an airline captain, 15 of those as a pilot for the CIA. After retirement, Lear crushed his neck and spine in a mining accident. He reluctantly took 2 prescribed pain medications that left him in a haze but eased the pain. That ended last year when medical providers were pressured by the CDC and DEA to start cutting back on opioids.
And I go down to Walgreens, they said, sorry, your doctor's been down here, says that you're taking an illegal drug, methamphetamine, and I can't issue these.
The idea that this 74-year-old retiree who rarely leaves home was partying with meth is ridiculous. But a urine test supposedly showed 10,000 nanograms of the drug in his system.
I wouldn't, honestly, I don't know what it is. I've never taken an illegal drug. I've been flying all my life. You can't take drugs and fly.
Lear was in agony without the medication, plus his health plan kicked him out. It's not uncommon.
A lot of doctors are doing that right now, and they're not necessarily waiting for him to die. They're just to say, I'm not going to treat you anymore. Or another method that they use is they give them a urine drug test, which are notoriously bad. They're not reliable, and they'll say, oh, there's marijuana in your system. I'm not going to treat you anymore.
In Nevada, as elsewhere, pain patients sign contracts and agree to certain conditions, including random drug tests. Millions of patients who played by the rules have seen their prescriptions cut in half or eliminated anyway, supposedly as a way to prevent opioid addiction.
The unintended victims are the senior citizens. If they can't get their medication, they aren't going to go buy heroin and shoot it and die of a heroin overdose. They're going to suffer.
Jeremy doesn't want his identity known. He was healthy his entire life, but then needed hip replacement surgeries and developed diabetes. With medication, he managed his chronic pain enough to still run his own business and support his family. His doctor didn't want to cut his prescriptions, but felt pressured to reduce them by half, which means Jeremy is in pain pretty much all the time and is running out of hope.
I want to be a productive citizen, and I don't want my fellow citizens of Nevada or of the United States to pay my bills and to cause them to have to do that because someone's trying to manipulate my pain specialist doctor. It just doesn't make any sense medically or financially.
The I-Team has received hundreds of emails and letters from pain patients in similar situations, patients who are not addicts but who need medicine to function. Amy has an incurable condition, RSD, more painful than childbirth, she says. When her medication was cut, she could no longer work. Pam's rheumatoid arthritis was previously manageable, but without meds, her quality of life is gone. Stacy is part of a support group for pancreatitis patients and admits, quote, "Some of us have suicide plans in place for when we can't take it any longer." Story after story from solid citizens who don't drink or smoke, whose lives have been shattered in the last year and feel abandoned by their doctors.
I changed you to Tresiba.
Las Vegas family physician Dr. Maurice Gregory bucks the trend in two ways. He still treats pain patients and he makes house calls to help those with mobility issues. Slashing opioids across the board as a reaction to addicts overdosing on street drugs is stupid, he says.
That's like going to a parking lot and you see that almost all of the handicapped spaces are being taken up by people who do not have a handicap sticker. So you say, bright idea. What we'll do is we'll reduce the total number of handicapped spaces.
We followed along with Dr. Gregory as he made house calls and spoke with his pain patients. Mostly, they are fearful about what their lives could be like if their pain meds are cut even more. Suicides among chronic pain patients have spiked in the last 2 years. It's not an idle threat. People lose all hope and decide to end their pain one way or another. More on that in future reports. Tonight at 11, Denise Valdez reports on how this kind of fear also permeates the ranks of doctors.
Amazing. Thanks, George.
Sure.
The government crackdown on opioid prescriptions is intended to curb the addiction crisis, but many of the people who are overdosing aren't getting the pills from a legal source.
Still, though, legitimate patients and compliant doctors are the ones being scrutinized, and many feel they're being lumped in with addicts despite following the rules. Tonight, in part 4 of our series, we talk to doctors who fear the guidelines go too far.
To try to create a relaxing, soothing environment for the patients so it could be just kind of an oasis when they get here.
Dr. Daniel Laird has been a pain specialist for more than 2 decades, treating thousands of patients using a mix of Western and Eastern approaches, yoga, acupuncture, aromatherapy, and only prescribing opioids as a last resort. But since the Center for Disease Control issued stricter guidelines severely limiting dosages, everyone in the opioid chain is alarmed.
Everybody's afraid. The pharmacist is afraid, the pharmacy manager is afraid, the district manager is afraid, the doctor's afraid, the nurses are afraid. Nobody wants to be accused of being a drug dealer or a drug dispenser or a drug pusher. And so everybody's constantly looking over their shoulder. This is the pain questionnaire that I have patients fill out every
Laird files nearly 50 pages of paperwork per visit per patient. He doles out opiates much more frequently than other doctors, so he is keenly aware that the feds and state agencies are monitoring him.
I suppose that every doctor has this horror scenario in his mind or her mind that the DEA is going to show up at your office door with a pair of handcuffs and confiscate all of your patient files and you'll be hauled off to federal prison.
Throughout the state of Montana, it's been like the Taliban took over pain management in Montana. It's kind of crazy.
Montana-based Dr. Mark Ibsen knows what it's like to be in the crosshairs. The Drug Enforcement Agency thought he was over-prescribing and raising the risk of addiction and overdose. Investigators came to his office multiple times, and he briefly lost his medical license.
This is a hostile regulatory environment, and I can't do it, and I can't help anybody if I'm in prison, so I stopped also. And, my patients were panicked, and I helped them taper down quickly, and I did my best to help them, but I wasn't going to risk my freedom. And the DEA came to check on me. They came to visit me 5 times. And it's sort of like the mafia coming to see you.
His license was eventually reinstated, but he no longer issues prescription painkillers. Stories like this are not that uncommon. Prosecute one doctor and it sends shockwaves throughout the medical community. Like Dr. Christensen, a practicing doctor in Montana who was charged with dozens of felony counts after 2 of his patients died from an overdose. Dr. Stefan Cortez from the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Medicine stresses doctors are being squeezed.
So there's doctors who truly believe that if they just stop prescriptions, they're in the clear. The patient will be better off, they hope, but they don't know for sure. So we have this perverse situation where if you reduce doses, even if it causes your patient to die from suicide or other forms of distress, the doctor's record looks better, not worse.
Physicians, prescribers, non-physician prescribers, etc., are scared. You know, they want to do what is best for their patient, but they are also a regulated profession. And in this current opioid or anti-opioid climate, at least as it relates to certainly prescription drugs, is that they do not want to knock on their door from the Drug Enforcement Administration. And so what we find is that a lot of physicians are opting out of pain management because it's just too much trouble. They're not getting supported, and they're becoming demonized, and much like pain patients are becoming demonized.
Meredith Lawrence and her husband Jay found out firsthand what happens when doctors put their own needs ahead of their patients. Jay Lawrence would have been bedridden without his pain medication. When the opioid crackdown came, the doctor dropped a bombshell of bad news.
And he looked me dead in the face, and I'll never forget it. It was the last thing he said to me. He said, "My patient's quality of life is not worth risking my medical practice or my license." And he walked out of the room like it was nothing.
A few days after he was taken off opioids, Jay Lawrence shot himself. Cutting a patient off cold turkey can be dangerous and even deadly. So the challenge is to strike a balance between the needs of a patient dealing with chronic pain while also reducing the risk of opioid-related overdose and deaths. That's why Dr. Laird requires his patients to sign a written agreement.
Part of the reason is that it lists everything that could go wrong with their opioid therapy. And it's a reminder to them, keep these medications locked up. Don't let little kids get near them. Don't let your pets eat the Percocet that falls on the floor. And the reason I do it is number one, to document that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be, but number two, to remind the patients that these are dangerous drugs. They really are, but they do have their place.
Now, we do have a special page on our website dedicated to the opioid crisis. It is in the links we mentioned section. And tomorrow night, we're going to show you how pharmacies are accused of profiling customers before even dispensing their pain relief. And you can join the conversation by using the hashtag #OurPain.
You're watching 8 News Now at 6.
All week long, we're taking a look at the opioid crisis here in Nevada and the unintended consequences of the crackdown on these pain medications.
Our investigation continues tonight as we look into how filling prescriptions has really changed in recent years and who's being left behind.
Patrick Walker is here to explain how pharmacies and the state fit into this giant puzzle.
Yeah, I think puzzle is really a good way to put this all, and that's because there are a lot of pieces that make up this big picture of tackling the opioid epidemic. Patients deal with the state, they have doctors, and then there are the pharmacies. Pharmacies are trying to get their hands way off of opioids, but as a result, they have a hot and cold relationship with everyone else. And it's the legitimate pain patients who have to deal with the fallout.
I can't stand very long. She can't stand very long.
20 years ago, Dean and Teresa Winford's lives changed forever.
We were stopped, and this diesel came from behind, and he didn't put on his brakes and hit us going 40 miles an hour.
A drunk trucker slammed into Teresa's van. She hurt her back. Doctors thought she would never walk again. They were wrong.
But my back was hurting so bad that they were giving me morphine.
Since then, she's been through the gauntlet. Surgeries and screws up and down her spine. Prescriptions for Percocet and fentanyl. Now she's left with chronic pain and complications from diabetes. Teresa says she is forced to get her hydrocodone and Percocet from visits to the ER because pharmacies are filling fewer and fewer prescriptions for opiate painkillers.
They immediately walk away, whoever's trying to help me. They get in a little in a little huddle in the back, and then another one will come up and say, we don't have that.
So why is this happening?
And time's gone by, we just wrote the medication, we gave it to the patient, they went to the pharmacy filled it, that was it.
Pain management doctor Maurice Gregory says that's all changed. His nurse, Julie McCaskill, fields calls every day from pharmacies to verify prescriptions. But more frequently, she says patients are walking away empty-handed without pharmacies getting the doctors involved.
Almost majority of our patients have already faced that type of dilemma where once they step into the pharmacy, pharmacists reject them, like without even question.
That rejection, a result of profiling.
Look, actually my age is an advantage.
This instructional video, distributed by the Nevada State Board of Pharmacy, tells pharmacists how to profile people who might be potential abusers or diverters.
In that moment of truth, we must evaluate the evidence in front of us, because it's not always who you think.
The unintended consequence of this, legitimate prescriptions going unfilled. That leads to people like Teresa Winford and thousands of others trying to fill prescriptions at other pharmacies. As a result, a red flag goes up of pharmacy shopping, thus perpetuating the cycle. At a recent pharmacy board hearing, I asked one of the board's attorneys whether or not patients in this situation have any course of action to fix it.
There is a regulation that allows a pharmacist to refuse to fill a prescription. Before they refuse to fill, the pharmacist is required to contact the prescriber, discuss their concerns.
General Counsel Paul Edwards acknowledges that this doesn't always happen and that the pharmacy board doesn't really get involved in these cases. But there's another concern pain management physicians like Dr. Gregory have, that pharmacies blacklist doctors they feel are too liberally prescribing opiate pain pills. Nurse Julie McCaskill says she learned from a patient that they were once blacklisted by a CVS pharmacy.
Bought his prescription, saw the name of the doctor, we gave the prescription back. He said, I'm not filling any medication for that doctor.
I also asked the pharmacy board's attorney about that. Doing that, is there a way to blacklist, a formal, informal, or something like that?
There's no formal way to blacklist. There's nothing in our regulations that allows for blacklisting, but I think it does occur.
Again, board representatives say they discourage the practice, but they also say there's not much they can do about it. The Winfords say somebody needs to sort it out because they are the ones suffering, along with countless other people just like them.
And all they see is a drug dealer. They don't know her medical history. They can see she's walking in medical shoes and can hardly walk. They see her wristband that she just got out of the hospital. She has papers with her from the hospital, and they don't want to fill it.
Well, the pharmacy board says you're always welcome to lodge your concerns with them. They tell me they want to know what's going on and then determine whether or not they can actually intervene. Now, there is still more to the pharmacy angle in all of this. Coming up tonight at 11 o'clock, guys, the I-Team's Vanessa Murphy is following a pain patient who is trying to fill a prescription, really all of the hurdles that they have to go through as they try to really fill what's a legitimate prescription and simply can't.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick.
All right.
Tonight, our series on opioids and the side of the crisis you don't normally hear about continues.
Patients dealing with chronic pain face a lot of hurdles to get the medicine they need, and one of those hurdles is at the pharmacy. The I-Team's Vanessa Murphy continues our series.
Pain patients want their medicine and the pharmacies want to stay out of trouble. Patients tell us they've been treated more like drug addicts rather than customers who need to manage their pain.
To be honest, I was a little offended.
We are not identifying this Las Vegas woman because, well, she doesn't want to jeopardize her chances of getting her pain medicine in the future, since she's helping to expose a problem many patients across the country face.
Do you feel like they're treating you like a drug addict?
Yes. Yeah, because they all give you that look like, here we go. Another drug addict looking to get their pills.
She says a work injury led to 6 surgeries, providing little improvement and chronic pain.
Today is my medication fill day.
She tells us she fills a prescription for her pain meds once a month, which can be a challenge.
This morning I will take gabapentin, my heart medication, tizanidine, and my morphine.
Through my shirt?
Yeah. The I-Team put a hidden microphone on her.
Does that work?
And witnessed her going to not 1.
They tell me that they can't fill my medications today.
Not 2.
So you're used to getting rejected?
Yes.
But 3 visits to find a pharmacy that would fill her prescription.
I'm offended because I wouldn't be going in and getting my medication if I didn't need it.
Offended by interactions in pharmacies like these.
Will those be able to be filled here?
We would have to call your doctor and to verify them first, because it is a high. We're not familiar with giving them these are high doses of medications. So
okay.
I can't guarantee you, so we'd have to talk to your doctor, see why they're being prescribed. This is one of the more strict locations.
Pharmacies in general are more strict. The I-Team's investigation has uncovered some pharmacies are putting caps on the number of pain prescriptions they will fill and turn legitimate pain patients away more and more as a result of the proclaimed opioid crisis.
Our culture has evolved to a point that you have to, you basically have to be anti-opioid, which means a lot of people are suffering.
The mega chain CVS announced a new plan to start in February of 2018, which would limit the supply of opioids for patients by giving them medication for 7 days only. The CDC refers to pharmacists as the first line of defense. And the I-Team has learned there's a blacklist in some pharmacies naming doctors suspected of writing prescriptions for too many opioids.
I went personally to the pharmacy and dropped off your medicine.
The I-Team rode along with Dr. Maurice Gregory as he visited pain patients.
What I will do is I will get their email of the particular pharmacist, that if I can, or the pharmacy or whomever, and I will send them educative materials and let them know about dosing, the guidelines, the real numbers. I will let them know anything and everything I can. I will give them what I'm looking at. And I don't know if that gets me off the blacklist.
The prescription gets a closer look, and so do the patients. Gregory says pharmacists often use their own patient profiling system and make decisions about who gets medicine and who does not based on personal appearance factors.
Our last patient, he got his hair cut, his shirt's tucked in. He's trying to look, reasonable, and he wants to have some pride. Should the person be looking disheveled? And if they come in looking disheveled, then you're going to say, wait a minute. This person looks like they just came off the street and they steal this script.
Essentially, pharmacies acting or reacting to a massive social crisis where there's a lot of fear, a lot of regulation, and a lot of attention.
Well, that pharmacy behind the window is Lord God Almighty. They can do whatever they individually want to do with that prescription.
For this patient, a prescription, she says, means less pain and a better life.
Muscle relaxer and extended pain medication.
According to the Nevada Board of Pharmacy, by law, pharmacists have a right to refuse prescriptions, and starting in January, more red tape for pain patients. All controlled substance prescriptions must include a code for a diagnosis. If it's not there, the prescription cannot be filled. Vanessa Murphy, 8 News Now.
Now, although pharmacists have the authority to refuse to honor a prescription, state law specifies that they are supposed to call the doctor to discuss overruling a legal prescription.
Doctors and pharmacists told us that this is the part of the law that's routinely ignored. You can watch more reports from our series, Our Pain, on LasVegasNow.com. And you can find more on our investigation into the other side of opioids tomorrow at 6 and 11.
Well, our series about the other side of the proclaimed opioid crisis continues tonight. The I-Team is uncovering how legitimate pain patients are struggling as a result of the nationwide crackdown.
Tonight, the I-Team's Vanessa Murphy has a closer look at police work on the issue and which drugs are actually the main threats.
Yeah, and police have been tasked with fighting this proclaimed opioid crisis. And here in Southern Nevada, police do find pain pills on the streets, but there's another drug which has really taken Southern Nevada by force, and an entirely different one they're bracing for.
I was bent over. I was doubled over.
Patients like Don Reitmeyer say it's a struggle to get their pain medicine.
They wound up putting me in the intensive care unit. I made the mistake of saying that I'd put my car into something if they didn't help my pain.
And some doctors say they don't want to get in trouble.
there's an environment of fear.
They point to new regulations being enforced, creating more hurdles to prescribe and fill prescriptions for pain medicine as a result of the proclaimed opioid crisis.
The battle against opioid abuse has become one of the top priorities of the Department of Justice.
It was a topic at this law enforcement conference in Las Vegas in October.
We have successfully prosecuted 7 doctors for illegal opioid distribution.
We keep hearing about the opioid crisis. Is it kind of backfiring, though, on legitimate patients and legitimate doctors?
It can. There's regulations out there, and a lot of people don't follow those regulations.
Are you hearing complaints from physicians, though, that they do need to prescribe these pills, but they're fearful now of law enforcement?
I hadn't personally heard that, but in the United States, we are overprescribing, in my opinion.
Turns out, according to this drug trafficking threat assessment obtained by the I-Team, Nevada is known by police to be among the top prescribers for oxy and hydrocodone, and Clark County is a source to send those drugs out of state.
Almost overnight, here it is.
Fentanyl, a heavy-duty pain medication.
Fentanyl deaths are up more than 540% in the last 3 years.
The report points to overdose deaths from fentanyl mixed with other drugs, mainly heroin. But this Drug Enforcement Agency report also points out the fentanyl that's killing people isn't the kind you get from the pharmacy.
The fentanyl helps enhance the euphoria of the heroin.
It's also cheaper than heroin, and police say it's being imported in large quantities, mainly from China and Mexico. In 2016 alone, investigators report 5 separate seizures of fentanyl in Nevada.
And it's cheaper to buy the fentanyl than it is the heroin.
Metro Detective Brian Grammis says police have discovered people buying pill presses off the internet and fooling their consumers.
Xanax, Oxycontin, Loratab, it has all the markings, looks identical to the actual pill, and in turn, it's actual fentanyl.
A Maryland sheriff's office posted this photo showing how little fentanyl is needed to kill someone.
Fentanyl is probably the most dangerous drug we've had on our streets ever in the history of America.
Overdoses have been reported simply from touching or inhaling the drug. While police work on how to equip themselves on handling fentanyl, they have another threat to deal with in Nevada, which isn't even an opioid: meth, which is a stimulant.
Back 7-8 years ago, we were buying meth, an ounce of meth for around $1,000. Well, now we're buying it for $300.
2 recovering addicts tell the I-Team it's not pain pills they kept finding.
It's everywhere. Everywhere. I've never had a problem getting it, ever.
We basically say that our streets are flooded with meth. They really are.
So how come opioids are getting so much attention then?
I think opioids are getting a lot of attention because these are prescription drugs that we use throughout our country that are for legitimate purposes, where meth is not legitimate, and people like you and I are affected by this.
Are you concerned that fentanyl will replace meth? Is that what it is?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's going to replace meth, and it's very, very dangerous.
Some doctors and pain patients like Reitmeyer tell the I-Team instead of using the umbrella term opioid crisis, we need to figure out another way to fight drug abuse, to stop people like him from falling through the cracks.
They need to distinguish, when they're going with opiate death, they need to distinguish, is that opiate a pill? Or was that heroin, or was it fentanyl?
The Metro Police Department has equipped some officers with Narcan, a spray to block the effect of an opiate and stop an overdose. And that's in case they come in contact with someone who is overdosing, or if they accidentally touch it. It's to protect them. It's very scary.
Just that little amount.
Teeny tiny.
For incredible. Vanessa, thanks.
Tens of millions of Americans depend on opioid medications to ease their chronic pain. Pain doctors say they'd like to wean their patients off of opioids when feasible, but many of the alternative treatments are not covered by public or private insurance programs. Tonight in our continuing series, The Other Side of Opioids, we explore the role of money in the evolution of this issue.
He said, we'll need a urine sample.
When retired pilot John Lear's erroneous drug screening came back dirty, he was cut off from his pain medications and was booted out of his medical plan. Lear was in agony for months.
Did you think you're going to die?
Yeah. Honestly, I was pretty close to killing myself because I just didn't think I could handle it. You know, I had a gun right here ready to go, my .45.
Lear suspects the medical provider wanted him gone because his long-term injuries were expensive to treat.
I run up a fantastic medical bill. It's probably, you know, in the $250,000 of medical fees. And they probably have said, we got to get rid of John Lear. I don't care how we do it. He's got to go. He's costing us too much money.
Everywhere you look in the opioid debate, money plays a key role. Some of the same pharmacy giants which cashed in on opioid sales during the pill mill era now require pain patients to obtain 2 non-opioid prescriptions for every pain medication they receive. Doctors often require patients to undergo expensive nerve block injections, whether they work or not.
It's not going to work, and yes, I will be cut off from my medication. So I'm going to figure out how to pay for it.
How do you know it won't work?
I've had it done many times, many times.
They don't want to pay for medicine, period. So this is what they'll do.
Family physician Maurice Gregory makes house calls to help chronic pain patients who have trouble getting around. Gregory says chronic pain patients often have expensive underlying conditions, the kind that insurers don't want to cover. Across the board, private insurance giants are cutting back coverage for pain patients. Some end up leaving their doctors or turn to street drugs. Many give up.
It's almost unbelievable the number of people whose lives have been destroyed, the number of people who are planning suicides, the number of people who tell me they don't want to live. The one entity that has not been, let's say, called out enough, that's hugely responsible for our current opioid problem and clearly responsible for the lack of treatment to chronic pain, are the insurance companies.
Example, Maurice Gregory recommends an integrated range of opioid alternatives, including physical therapy and acupuncture, but they're not covered by private or government insurance. Pain expert Dr. Michael Shatman says the U.S. had more than 1,000 interdisciplinary pain programs covered by insurance back in 1999. Today?
Now, outside the VA and the military, we're under 70 of these programs because insurance stopped paying for them.
Unfortunately, some years ago, the healthcare system was changed under Obamacare.
Forrest Tennant, a pioneer pain management doctor, thinks the opioid crisis is entirely about money.
This is a deal to shift money. It's not to save money. Opioids are a very inexpensive way to help people who are truly ill have a life, keep their health up, live longer, take care of their families, take care of their jobs. In other words, this is a farce.
Tomorrow night, the final 2 segments of our opioid project at 6 p.m., how the Veterans Administration handles opioid issues on behalf of injured vets. And then at 11 p.m., what we've learned and ideas on how to move forward. You can find additional materials on our website.
You're watching 8 News Now at 6.
Among the millions of people coping with chronic pain every day, many of them are veterans suffering the most.
The years of service and injuries take their toll, and for many, the only relief comes from opioids. But navigating the VA system is far from easy, and fewer prescriptions are being written.
So tonight, John Langler continues our look at our pain, what the impact it's having on veterans.
And there are so many veterans here in Southern Nevada. This isn't necessarily, though, a problem with Veterans Affairs. In reality, they're only following the rules handed down from the federal government. But the lack of prescription opioids is leaving legions of vets in chronic pain years after they served their country.
I
am one of the problem patients.
When Bosco Kadick sat down with us, you could tell it was painful. Not because of the conversation, though the topic was deeply personal.
I'm 100% disabled.
For Kadick, pain simply never goes away.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, left leg, secondary for my right knee, secondary for my back. I've had roughly around 30 broken bones.
Kadick joined the Army in 1975.
It's an 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the 3rd Squadron.
He's a Cold War veteran who for a time says he was imprisoned by East Germans. It's an experience that opens up the physical and mental pain he still holds.
I always called our unit a suicidal delay force because we were expected to be overrun.
His time in the military is like a menu of injuries at the most insufferable restaurant.
I wound up with 41 operations, 18 operations on the left knee. I've had 2 titanium knees, total knee replacement, ruptured my entire quadriceps, my quadriceps tendon.
Relief comes from opioids.
Without it, I would be in bed. I wouldn't be getting up and going around, and with the medication, it improved the quality of my life.
But like so many other veterans, quality of life achieved through pain medication is being taken away. Efforts by federal regulators and agencies to curb drug abuse has motivated the VA to siphon off opioids. Dosages have been cut down, and patients are now forced to go to the doctor more frequently for prescriptions they sometimes won't write. Kadick has dealt with this firsthand.
Basically, you were stigmatized as a junkie.
We know that for a few pennies from the God-given opium poppy plant, we can save their lives.
Dr. Forrest Tennant is one of many in the medical community pushing the feds to relax its rules. Some of his patients are vets too.
He has both his leg gone and a brain cancer that's growing, and his VA hospital will not give him a codeine or a Norco for pain. Not one. They won't even give him a Tylenol for pain.
And the absence of opioids is taking a real toll. Suicides among veterans is up. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs reported 127 vets took their own lives in Nevada. And while not all are associated with chronic pain, experts have noticed a nationwide trend. Some who have served just cannot live with the pain.
Let's call it like it is. The crisis is not the opioids.
For Kadick, the crisis is in his knees, and it's not going away.
That once you get so many surgeries, they don't want to deal with you because they know they're going to be prescribing, and it's just a numbers game now. We did serve honorably, and we put our lives on the line. I'm scarred physically and emotionally. I'm wounded, you know, so, but I'm sure many veterans are, and they are.
There is some hope that alternative medicines can help, but that largely depends on the patient and what they're dealing with. Dr. Tennant, who you saw in that story, says many who have chronic pain need a lot more than medical marijuana, for example, to help. The VA has an opioid safety initiative to try and help veterans, and we have a link to that on our website. So if you are dealing with something like this, you want some more information from the VA, go ahead and check out our website.
And we'll have another part tonight at 11 o'clock.
All
right, John, thanks.
Well, chronic pain costs the U.S. about $600 billion each year, far more than addiction or even illegal drugs. Well, as we've been reporting, in response to a spike in overdose deaths, the CDC last year targeted prescription opioids. The CDC guidelines were supposed to be voluntary, but instead they were enacted into law all over the country. Millions of chronic pain patients have since been cut off from medication, while overdose deaths continue to rise. Tonight, in the conclusion of our series, George Knapp shares some of the voices of pain.
She got a cigarette burning in her hand, y'all. Put it in the box.
5 years ago, few of us knew how to spell opioid. Now, these viral images are the faces of an epidemic, wasted junkies obliterated by dope.
What did you take?
The line between street drugs and prescription medications has been blurred, as if on purpose. Now, all drug deaths get blamed on opioids, even though heroin and illicit fentanyl smuggled into the country are the primary causes.
Another one of the great frauds and deceptions, and calling it a crisis, it's a crisis in those young people who are out there taking drugs on the street, but these are not legitimate pain patients who are going to physicians, taking their medicines as prescribed.
The idea has taken hold that if you simply stop a pain patient's opioids, you're doing something about an addiction crisis. You are not.
Well, I like to play my fingers these two fingers don't work as well as they used to.
Las Vegas PR consultant Terry Murphy admits she is still angry at Big Pharma for what it unleashed more than a decade ago. During the pill mill wave, a member of her family overdosed and died. Another relative lives with extreme chronic pain. Her views morphed when Murphy became a pain patient herself. She had 2 surgeries on her neck. Opioids and her employees allowed her to run her business from home for almost 2 years.
I did take medication from time to time, and because I didn't have to really go out a lot and people understood what I was going through, I was able to do it. Now, I always thought, though, gee, what if I didn't have that luxury. I mean, that's a huge luxury when you're going through that kind of pain. What if I was, you know, a food server or a bartender or a construction worker?
Murphy could afford alternative pain therapy, so wasn't dependent on opioids alone. She's still angry at the drug companies, but is more nuanced about opioids.
According to my understanding, it's a disease that can be triggered by sunlight, by certain dose of antibiotics, I think. So I may have had it my whole life.
This Henderson professional has endured crippling pain caused by lupus. Opioid therapy allowed him to move, be active. He lost close to 200 pounds, but like millions of others, he battles every month with insurance and pharmacies. The pain is always near.
It makes you feel like you just want to stop existing. And I would never say that, you know, about my family or my kids, that I don't want to be there for them. But when you're in that much pain and that you just don't see a way out, it's soul crushing.
I had a hip replacement back in 1990.
This patient, Jeremy, is still hanging on, still running his business from home, but he has trouble getting around or exercising now that his prescriptions have been slashed, against the wishes of his pain doctor.
They go in to get their prescription filled and they go, sorry, we're not taking any new patients. So having done nothing wrong other than get your hip replaced, you don't get anything for pain, even right after surgery.
They look at you like you're a criminal too. Like,
right, you get treated as public enemy number one.
I can sleep at night, which is a big bonus. And I can actually spend time with my granddaughter.
So without the medication, or those years when you were in pain and without it, your life was a mess.
It was a disaster, yeah. I felt pretty worthless. Not that I don't now, but I felt worse then.
Couldn't leave the house? Couldn't work?
No.
Couldn't play with the kids?
No.
I shattered my L2 vertebrae.
At a young age, Gary's body was mangled in an accident. His doctors discovered that because of his genetics, low doses of opioids didn't work. He needed prescription fentanyl to ease his blinding pain. For a while, he had a somewhat normal life. That's gone now.
The insurance company refuses to pay for that unless you have cancer, because it's so expensive. And
how expensive?
They were charging $20,000 a month for my prescription. And I asked my doctor, I said, that's insane. Why should it cost so much? And my doctor's response was, the DEA forces us to charge that much because they don't want it on the street.
So, yet it's all over the street.
Right.
Just doctors can't prescribe it, but it's all over the street.
Right.
It's called the land of the standing rocks.
Retired pharmacist Rick Martin can no longer follow his passion as a landscape photographer. Instead, he's poured his energies into advocating on behalf of fellow pain patients. Millions of people have been forced to taper off opioids because of the CDC guidelines.
Many physicians, insurance companies have misinterpreted, misread, misunderstood, and outright lie, as far as I'm concerned, about what the CDC guidelines are intended for. I have quotes from people from the CDC where they say it's voluntary, it's not a rule, law, or regulation. Involuntary tapers are not what they intended.
When faced with years of pain ahead and no chance of relief, many who are cut off from medication do what Jay Lawrence did. His wife Meredith bought the gun, then drove him to their favorite park.
And he looked at me and said, it's time. It's time to go. And put the gun up to his chest and he pulled the trigger. And he was gone before he hit the ground, they told me. But I was the one that called the police.
George Knapp, 8 News Now.
We will continue to follow issues and stories related to chronic pain, opioids, and addiction, and we welcome your input. You can share your own experiences with pain on our Facebook page, on our website. We have a mountain of related resources and links, including a letter from the CDC which says the agency never intended to impose forced tapering on pain patients.
At 6.
A prominent pain doctor who was part of our special project about the war on opioids is now the focus of a DEA investigation.
Dr. Forrest Tennant is a nationally known pain expert who has really been outspoken in the criticism of the opioid crackdown, but now he finds himself Crosshairs. The I-Team's George Knapp is here with his update tonight.
You know, anyone who saw our opioid project and about chronic pain patients will remember Dr. Tennant. He defends the use of high doses of opioids for some patients with intractable pain because for them it works. When the DEA searched his home and office last week, other pain doctors and patients saw it as a warning shot in a war that has left millions of people in a twilight zone of agony.
We've known opioids relieve pain, I think, before Christ was here. This is not new information.
California physician Dr. Forrest Tennant has been outspoken in his defense of opioids for treating chronic pain patients. At the recent Pain Week convention in Las Vegas, he was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award for the research he's done at his small clinic in West Covina. Back in July, Tennant's work was profiled by Reason TV.
My job is to relieve pain and suffering.
Last week, DEA agents entered the clinic to seize patient files and financial records. A search warrant outlines DEA's suspicions. Because he prescribes high doses of opioids to his patients, DEA thinks Tennant could be running a drug operation in which his patients sell their medication, then kick back money to the doctor.
I find these things to be totally so far out of line, it's hard to respond almost.
Tennant says it's no secret he prescribes high doses of opioids. His clinic is open only 1 week per month and treats a mere 150 patients total, all of them special cases in severe pain, referred by other doctors who could no longer help them. Since 2016, when the CDC issued supposedly voluntary guidelines for doctors, a nationwide crackdown on opioid prescriptions has left millions of chronic pain patients in an agonizing limbo.
It's all the things around the regulations that are causing the doctors to drop out. My phone is filled up by 9 a.m. in the morning, and I feel terrible. We should be having a discussion. What are we going to do with these people? They're tragic, and people are being harmed physically, mentally, emotionally. Families are being destroyed. I've never seen anything like it in this country.
Tennant says he understands that the DEA needed to go after pill mill doctors back when that was rampant, but that's not him. None of his patients have overdosed, and none have been caught selling their meds. Many fly in from other states where opioid medications have been severely curtailed. Since the DEA raid, several patients have stepped forward to say Tennant saved their lives. They include severely wounded Iraq war veterans abandoned by the VA and others who have terminal cancer.
Are we going to just let these people die miserable much before their time, or are we going to provide them some palliative care to be comfortable when they die?
The doctor says his clinic is not a moneymaker. Patients confirm he barely charges them at all. The main mission, Tennant says, is to study chronic pain and search for alternatives. News of the DEA actions seem to have roused other pain researchers. Several have written impassioned defenses of Tennant's work. Utah Dr. Lynn Webster was likewise targeted by the DEA. 4 years after his clinic was raided, the government announced no charges would be filed. By that time, Webster had sold his practice.
Whenever you're investigated, there are people that believe there's guilt. And I will have to live with that the rest of my life.
He and other pain experts suspect the raid on Tennant was meant to intimidate physicians who still prescribe opioids. Tennant, who is nearly 77 years old, says he isn't going to shut down because his 150 patients have nowhere else to go.
To get a lot of people who are not pain patients or even related are starting to see the gross injustice of all this and the tragedy of all this, because guess what? If they can take this person's medical treatment away and let them die, is heart failure medicine next? Is insulin next because they don't like it or the cost?
The DEA search warrant specifically mentions the huge cost of fentanyl that Tennant has prescribed for some patients. Also named in the warrant was a pharmacy often used by his patients. Included in the warrant are notations that Dr. Tennant was fined 20 years ago and was reprimanded 17 years ago for a misdemeanor charge about his billing. DEA started its current investigation in 2015, but obtained and served the warrant last week on the same day Dr. Tennant was in Montana to testify in the trial of another pain doctor. We have additional resources on our website if you want to learn more.
Interesting. A lot more, I think, is coming from the story.
Sure,
too.
we're going to stay on it.
Thanks, George.
Millions of chronic pain patients already living in agony because of disease or injuries now live in fear that their medicine will be taken away because they've been stigmatized as drug addicts. News stories about opioid overdoses are pretty common, but few of those who OD are actually pain patients. 90% of those who die of overdoses use illicit drugs. Pain doctors say that when it comes to opioids, there is a big difference between addiction and dependence. George Knapp has our story.
And we're going to see an increase in drug overdoses.
Pain specialist Dr. Jim Marks probably didn't make any new friends on the Nevada Medical Board when he proclaimed during a board workshop that slapping new restrictions on opioid medications would cause more overdose deaths, not fewer. News reports about the so-called opioid epidemic routinely claim that opioids kill more than 60,000 Americans per year. But it's not prescription drugs. Opioid prescriptions have dropped every year since 2011 by nearly 50%, but opioid deaths during that period have gone up. One reason is because addicts who previously, one way or another, obtained prescription meds are now taking street drugs. If someone had a plan to drive Americans to try heroin, it worked.
What we've done is we've created a target-rich environment for the illegal drug trade. This is a wonderful. They're probably sending the legislators Christmas cards now. I mean, this is a great thing for them.
Because when we talk about opioids, are we talking about prescription opioids, or are we talking about illicit opioids such as heroin? Heroin cannot be prescribed in the United States, but it is being conflated with all other opioids to unfortunately perhaps boost the statistics. This creates a certain amount of hysteria and alarm.
Steven Ziegler teaches public policy at a major university, but previously worked as a DEA agent. After decades of various wars on drugs, he says, the streets of America are flooded with stronger, cheaper, and more powerful versions of every one of them. Illicit fentanyl, smuggled in from China and other places, is 100 times more powerful than heroin and is the single deadliest opioid of all, a 540% increase in ODs in 1 year. Policymakers mistakenly lump together all opioid deaths, whether legal or illicit, and in order to do something about it, they've gone after the only non-moving target, chronic pain patients, who are now paying a terrible price because of irresponsible actions by addicts.
To arbitrarily deny prescription pain medication to those folks that need it, to reduce dosage without regard to their individual condition and function is problematic, because when people are experiencing pain, if they cannot get the relief legitimately through their prescriber, what do you think is going to happen?
For millions of chronic pain patients, opioids are the only thing that works. The medicine allows Rick Martin to go grocery shopping for himself. It means Nicole Ball has the energy to play with her grandkids. It keeps this lupus patient from ending his excruciating pain by taking his own life.
We have patients that we've been seeing for 25 years on stable doses of medication who have not overdosed.
But in the eyes of politicians and some regulators, opioid users are addicts who must be forcibly taken off drugs. Dr. Marks says pain patients are certainly dependent on their medications, the same way a diabetic needs insulin, but that dependence is not addiction.
And addiction is a psychosocial phenomenon where there's adverse consequences.
Mark says pain patients can take opioids basically forever without harm. It allows them to keep their jobs, remain active, have a life. Those who've had their meds cut have suffered terribly, and many have committed suicide. Their need for medication, though, is not addiction.
Dependence is not addiction. Withdrawal is not addiction. Addiction is a separate, completely separate matter. A lot of people can be managed well on opioid therapy, prescription opioid therapy. It's not for everybody. Some cannot. But for those that are managed well, why are you trying to change their treatment?
George Knapp, 8 News Now.
Nevada doctors have asked the state medical board to delay implementation of even stricter prescription guidelines because they're concerned about unintended consequences. Tomorrow at UNLV's Boyd School of Law, doctors, attorneys, and policymakers will spend a full day discussing and debating opioid regulation and policies. If you would like to see that full interview with Dr. Ziegler, who appeared in our story, we've posted a link on our website.
You have probably heard political figures make the claim that at least one Nevadan dies every day from an opioid overdose. That figure of more than 360 opioid deaths per year in our state has been repeated over and over, but is it true? The answer, not really. The I-Team's George Knapp got a hold of the records on which the claim is based. Here's his exclusive story.
In Nevada, statistics show that 99.98% of all opioid prescriptions do not result in overdoses, but the crackdown on pain medicine has continued to intensify anyway. Like most pain management physicians, Dr. Dan Laird has been overwhelmed by the rush of chronic pain patients who've essentially been abandoned by their doctors.
Thousands of patients whose doctor has said, I'm sorry, I can't prescribe opiates anymore. You're going to have to find someone else. And there just isn't anybody.
When the CDC issued vague and unsubstantiated guidelines for opioids 2 years ago, it set off a nationwide panic among doctors, pharmacists, and regulators who simply said no. The result has been chaos. A recent study shows opioid prescriptions dropped 29% from 2011 through 2017. But during that same time, opioid deaths rose 85%. Heroin and fentanyl deaths exploded. Cutting back on legal pain meds not only failed to stop overdoses, it had the opposite effect. So how can that be? The coroner's office keeps track of all opioid-related deaths. These are the lists from 2017 through the first quarter of 2018.
This information that I guess your team has been able to obtain is a game changer, because what it does is it confirms every suspicion I have had and other doctors have had about the dishonesty that's associated with this, with the publicity that surrounds this purported crisis.
The first fatality of 2017 lists heroin, hydromorphone, and methadone, along with pneumonia. The second case, methamphetamine and opiates intoxication. The third, pneumonia, asthma, tobacco, marijuana, congestive heart failure, along with meth and cocaine. All the way down the page, it's the same picture over and over. Multiple drugs, most of them illegal, often combined with alcohol, and the decedents also had serious underlying health issues. To label these as opioid deaths is a stretch.
It appears, just looking at this and making a very preliminary assessment, that if the toxicology showed an opioid in their system at the time of their death, that it's counted as an opioid death, which is quite misleading.
The records from 2018, more of the same. Heroin plus cardiovascular disease, inhalation injuries due to smoking meth. Or how about this one? Multiple drugs along with cirrhosis, HIV, and leukemia. Or these examples of pretty much every licit and illicit drug one could name. Chronic pain patients like Rick Martin of Henderson are in pain management programs. They're tested. They follow the rules. But because of addicts taking deadly amounts of heroin or other drugs, these patients who follow the rules have been cast aside as collateral damage. Nevada is not yet as strict as many other states, but the political rhetoric is amping up in this election year, and the oft-cited figure of one Nevadan per day dying of opioids continues to resonate.
17 people a day in Nevada die of heart disease. 14 people a day die of cancer. 4 people a day die in Nevada of lung cancer every day. So it's important to keep these things in perspective. 1 person a day dies in Nevada of an opioid overdose, but that includes everybody on this list. That includes everybody who had an opiate in their system at the time of their death.
George Knapp, 8 News Now.
About 1 in every 40 of the deaths listed in the records involve a single prescription opiate, and there is no indication whether the decedent obtained the drugs through a legal prescription or other means. Now, you can see the entire list of causes of death on our website, LasVegasNow.com. Because of privacy concerns, we have removed the names.